Okay. All right, now let's go back. Okay, so as I was saying, to start this conversation, we need to do what's called defining our variables. Because as I mentioned before we started recording, in popular culture and regular conversation, we tend to use the terms emotion and feelings and how we feel as far as our affect, in more general terms, and sometimes we're not using them in the same context. And that's not a really good way to go about and do research. Um, and so we're going to define the terms first. I do want to say just really quick because when people look at studying things like feelings and emotions and things like this, you instantly go to the clinical psychologist and counselor psychologist about how are you feeling today? How's your emotional state? Have you done mindfulness to relax your anxiety and those kinds of things? And so it kind of sounds like a very soft area in the field of psychology. But as a scientist, if you want to go into the science side of psychology and you want to study emotions and feelings, I would recommend that before you go to university, you get up through Calculus 2 here at TOCC. And then when you go into your bachelor's years, make sure you take the higher end statistics class, differential equations, those types of things. Because on the scientific end of studying emotions and feelings, if you open the Journal of Emotions, for example, it's very little text, but it's pages and pages of equations, and how we can predict an emotion based on different variables and at what level of those it's very mathematic. Okay. And I know that surprises a lot of people, but it kind of goes back to this notion that emotions and feelings, how do we measure them when we can't see them all the time? And the same idea goes into physics. Nobody has actually really seen, for example, an atom or a quark or a black matter, whatever that is, and those types of things. Those have never actually been visually identified, but they're identified through experiments that then produce a whole bunch of numbers and equations that then physicists work through to say this is a real thing. Okay, but it's called doing a mathematical proof. And same goes with the studies of emotions, because we don't always have direct access to emotions and feelings. We have to represent it in some understandable objective term. Okay, so just wanted to make that note, because I know a lot of times when people are, oh, we're going to talk about feelings. I want you to understand kind of what we're doing in the field of science when we talk about it. Okay. So first, let's go through the difference between emotion, a drive, and a motivation. Okay. A drive is something that is not based on our experience. Okay. Now, there can be some classical conditioning and conditioning to these that give us preferences, but these are things that just exist by being a biological being. So some examples are hunger, thirst, sex, intimate love, survival instincts, and experience of pain. We're all driven towards these things, and they don't always happen at the level of consciousness. Most of the time, these drives are happening in the brain stem, telling us we're hungry, those kind of things. But then we do need to note this. Preferences come into place based on experience. So when we get a hunger pain, if we don't like cabbage, we don't go and bite into a head of cabbage, right? We'll get something that meets our experience. When we're thinking about, for example, sex, we're just not gonna go out and have sex with anyone. We're going to use preferences based on culture, experience, family upbringing to really relieve that drive, okay? So while we say that it's not really based on experience, because we experience them no matter what, we do then develop preferences, okay? Motivation is a combination of drive and experience. So for example, this is adding on to the basic drive, right? So when we get hungry, we get motivated to eat a certain type of food and avoid others. When we're seeking out intimate love, it goes into the motivation system, and we seek out those individuals who we feel would be compatible for us, okay? All right, so motivation then drives us to relieve a drive, okay? Emotions, and this is important to know, emotions are situationally bound responses to stimuli that have two purposes, okay? One is to bring about awareness in ourself, internal awareness that something is happening that is good or that is happening that is bad. And two, provide a signal to others of what we're experiencing. Okay, so example, looking at a baby and smiling and seeing a snake and feeling fear. Those are two different kind of experiences that produce two different type of emotions, okay? Now, I do want to go back because this is a physiological response. One of the things we should know about emotions in the definition that we're using is emotions are a physiological response to a stimuli in the environment that will either bring about things like feelings of joy, happiness, or content, or fear, danger, anger, and aggression, okay? But they are what we call situationally bound, because what we know physiologically is when that stimulus is gone, the physiological response stops, okay? And a lot of people think, well, you know, if I have a bad experience with someone, it just goes with me all day long, right? So, you know, your roommate or your spouse was an ass this morning, and you just keep going back and thinking about the stuff they said or the way they acted, okay? Now, I want you to think about this though, and why we continue to have that physiological response is because we're reliving the situational bound stimuli. Okay, we don't think of any, what keeps us upset or keeps us angry is the reproduction of that situation, okay? And that's why things like mindfulness meditation techniques, distraction techniques are often used to help people control emotional states. Because, for example, in mindfulness, the whole purpose of mindfulness is to get you to stop thinking about your past, get you to stop thinking about your future, and get you to think about the here and now. And the whole idea behind this meditation is you sit and you can either count your breaths or something like this, but anytime your mind starts to wander, you bring yourself back to the experience you're having right now. And if you think about this, what this does in emotional regulation is it makes it so you don't continually go and revisit that negative or positive emotional state that you experience. So you don't continue having it as part of your experience, as you would say. All right, affect, this is also called in lay terminology mood, is our general sense of being that goes across situations. Example, person stating that they were moody all day, even though they were in a carnival, for example. Affect is, for example, how wakeful you are, how you're experiencing a sunny day versus a rainy day. It's all of those things that no matter what do transcend situations And it's this general way of being throughout the day. And that's what we refer to when we talk about affect, okay? Now, feelings, and again, these are often, emotions and feelings are often interchangeable. But when we're talking about them in the context of this class, the way they're being defined is emotions are a physiological response to a stimuli. Our feelings are our interpretation of that physiological experience, okay? So the example in this slide is I was scared of you because of the mask that reminded me of the movie Scream, okay? The reason why when we're studying these things scientifically that we separate emotions and feelings is that our labeling, our language cognitive labeling of emotions are not always correct, okay? Meaning that we may have a wrong label for a given emotion. And I think I may have discussed this in this class before about this difference, but it's a good kind of example to express why we separate these two. Is working in, again, the domestic violence field and looking at this research in this area, it's not uncommon for a child who experienced chronic abuse from their parent to mislabel what we would call the emotion or feeling of love. So feeling cared for, nurtured, thought well of, all of those emotions that are associated with the label of love, okay? Reason being is, as we'll learn when we get to the personality section, Carl Jung argued that we're all born with archetypes, okay? Across culture, there is the archetype of the mother or the mother figure, okay? And with that archetype across cultures are all of the qualities of this term or this feeling we call love, okay? And so we're born with that mental archetype, and then we look at mom and look at her reactions to start labeling the emotions we experience with mom, okay? So what's happening in an abusive, neglectful house? Well, they're seeing mom as an angry, emotionally unstable, harmful individual, not nurturing, not caring, and all of these things. And so it's not uncommon for young children to mislabel the feeling of love for the feeling of pain, excuse me, let me reverse that, the feeling of pain for the feeling of love, okay? And so what can happen sometimes when getting into adulthood and dragging those labels with individuals is not all, some individuals who always end up getting in bad relationships over and over and over is because they have a mislabeling of what love should be experienced as. So when they get in a relationship with someone that is love and they're feeling that pain of degradation and abuse, they think, well, this must be love because this is what I'm experiencing here, okay? And so that's kind of one of the more clear examples of why we separate these two things. And we'll see, when we get into therapy and things like that, and people with anxiety issues and depression issues and those kinds of things often have a mislabeling of their emotions, and they get stuck. Well, we'll get to this in just a minute. We'll get to depression and anxiety in a minute. Okay. Now, the last point that I do want to make in this section is that we experience all of these from day to day, and this is what can get confusing. We have drives and motivations. We have negative and positive emotions. Our affect, depending on where it is, can set our experience of these emotions and motivations. And so it's important not to just say, well, we can put these in compartments because they do interact. But for this sake, we're going to do kind of a reductionist model to kind of explore these ideas. Okay. Now, if anyone is a visual person, this is kind of a visual representation of what we just talked about. So if we look at, the roots of our tree, so this represents us. We look at it, we have our genetics, we have our collective past. And if we often look in the literature about historical trauma, this is kind of that collective past that is coming through. Environmental conditions, whether we live in an impoverished area or a nutrient area, those kinds of things that give way to our biological health, right? Our roots then go into the trunk of our tree, which is our drive, because the trunk really is what's feeding the roots, and the roots are what's feeding the tree. Okay. And then above this, of course, our drive goes more into the branches of motivation, where it's receiving information from all of this and saying our leaves need to be bigger, our branches need to be bigger, smaller, dependent on all of these conditions. And then emotions are where we really experience a tree, right? So we experience the leaves, and we can experience the environment and how the environment is treating the tree, and the feelings are then the health of those leaves. Okay, so if you're more of a visual person, this is kind of one way to kind of look at what we just looked at in the previous slide about kind of this metaphor of a tree. Okay. And just to emphasize this point more about emotions and feelings, emotions play out in the theater of the body, while feelings play out in the theater of the mind. Emotions precede feelings, and can be measured physiologically, emotions. And usually feelings can only be measured by examining thoughts and interpretations of emotions, okay? So this again is just making that line and defining, at least for our sake of the class, the differences between these things. Okay. So let's talk about, I do want to make a special note because at the end of the class, we are going to talk about mood disorders and stress disorders. Mood disorders are often guised under things like depression and bipolar. Stress disorders, we can think about post-traumatic stress, anxiety disorders. I just want to emphasize that when we're dealing with disorders, we're dealing with an experience that has hijacked the emotion and feeling system, okay? So it either imbalances, for example, serotonin levels and dopamine levels in the brain to give about depression and symptoms of depression or bipolar, but also it hijacks the feeling system, okay? So when we get to mood disorders, we'll talk about something about that's called rumination, okay? And this is the same with anxiety disorders, is we get stuck in a thought loop where we really start to think that we're worthless, we're not worth anything, and we start to look for evidence of that worthlessness, and we get stuck in this cognitive cycle, okay? So when we get to mood disorders, this is really a hijacking of our emotion and feeling system. And it's important to recognize that as we go into it. And we'll see in other types of disorders, such as psychosis, there are things that are called positive symptoms, where it's again a hijacking of these systems, where people can experience schizophrenia and depression and those types of things. And again, what we are starting to find quite a bit in the literature is a lot of depressive and stress disorders. And there's even some evidence for things like schizophrenia that it really comes down to unresolved traumas that the person has experienced in their life. That really is the things that kind of knock off our biological system and our cognitive system and have a spiral, okay? So when we're talking about this, I just want you to keep this in mind if you're interpreting this in the guise of depression you've experienced or anxiety you've experienced. Just remember this is an amplification. That experience is an amplification and hijacking of what really is a very efficient system. If we were to say evolution put a bet on anything, it put a bet that our emotional system will make it so we survive very well, and it has done a good job. But we do need to keep this in mind that there can be problems with it that have to be addressed. Okay, just as a review, when we talked about emotions, we talked about how they're situationally bound, their physiological experience. They do have a cognitive component that we call feelings. And the primary purpose of emotions is to signal that something is right or wrong, both internally, but emotions are also something we use to connect with other human beings and let others know our state of being, okay? So they have a dual purpose, and this is why when we get to, for example, human development, we'll put social development and emotional development in the same category. Because they are kind of bound with each other. We learn about emotions through social interaction, as we will see when we get to that section. And so it's important to keep in mind that emotions are not this just internal experience we have. It's meant to be expressed. And of course, when we get to social psychology, we'll talk about, could it be that the reason why we're having such a mental health crisis with men is because of these centuries of telling them they shouldn't experience happiness or nurturing feelings or sadness or express emotions that are occurring. So we're blocking a natural biological process. And a lot of theorists and sociologists and psychologists have wondered if that's what's been creating the mental health crisis that we see with a lot of men today. Okay. And this is just, again, more on the situational bounding of emotions. So let's get into an example of emotions. And the one that I like to use is loneliness as an example of emotions and motivation, okay? Because what's unique about the experience of loneliness, which we'll, for now, define as a thwarting of belonging. So losing a close one, losing your identity, you're losing your self in a sense, okay? What's unique about the experience of loneliness is that it's an emotional motivational state, okay? On the emotional end, our emotion is trying to protect us from further loss. So a lot of people who become lonely tend to try to withdraw themselves from their social world. They tend to become what's called hypervigilant. They become more aware and more sensitive at people's emotional states. So for example, in the lab, we measure loneliness, and lonely people are more accurate at predicting facial expressions. They're more accurate of telling the emotion based on tone of voice than are non-lonely people. So we become very hypersensitive to people's emotional and responses to the world. The difficult about, and so we can say this is kind of the serotonin system at work, okay, which is really the emotional system. At the same time, we have a motivational state, or what if we put it in brain terms, dopaminergic. So motivation is associated with dopamine, okay? The motivational state is trying to regain our sense of belonging, saying, let's get out there, let's meet people, let's try and get with others and regain a sense of who we are. Okay. I'm being boring today. I want to go to sleep. Within this, the research has shown that there's actually two types of loneliness. The first one is social loneliness. If you look it up in the scientific literature, it's also known as social isolation. Okay. And this is when when an individual experience insufficient number of social connections. Okay. And I always like to liken this type of loneliness to social media. All right. There's some people I know on social media that if they have 100,000 followers or friends, they feel good, they feel okay. But when those numbers start going down, they start to feel anxious about it. And then there's some people on social media that are happy with having 10 to 15 followers. They're good with that. They feel okay, and they're fine. My point really quickly at this point is that you will see that there's subjectiveness in this, okay? So when we go back to the notion of food, right? There's some people that can eat once a day, drink a couple times a day, and they feel fine, okay? And then there are some people who need to eat their 3 meals a day and have a snack in between, and then they feel okay. I want you to think of loneliness in the same kind of way. Some of us need a lot of social connection. Some of us need very little, and we feel fine. Okay. Emotional loneliness is a little bit different. It's the experience when an individual does not have at least one significant emotional relationship. So emotional loneliness most commonly occurs when a person breaks up with their intimate partner, loses their close parent or close friend. They experience some type of loss of that intimate relationship, okay? Again, this is a subjective experience. And I'll go use an example of a couple of my friends. One friend, when she experiences a loss, something emotional is going on in her life, she'll call me, and then she'll call another friend, then she'll call her mom, and then she'll call her sister, and she might do that again before she feels some type of regaining of connection and emotional connection with other people. On the other hand, I have another friend that if they have a social experience where they feel rejected or something, they could call me or they could call another one of our friends and be just fine. Okay. Again, it's a subjective experience. And so I think we can end with this today, and then we can finish this section off on Tuesday. I just want to go because I mentioned that, you know, the scientific ideas behind this. And if you remember at the beginning of the semester, we talked that there's 4 goals of psychology. One is to describe, understand, predict, and control. And if we look at the studies of loneliness, it's kind of went through these transitions. So if we look here between 1910 to 1970, loneliness went through some transitions in how it's defined. In the 1910s and 1920s, based upon interviews with people who live in very rural, isolated places, loneliness was actually defined as a mental disorder and a component of psychosis. Because in these studies, when they went in and studied these people, they tended to find that people who tended to have a mental illness such as psychosis also were extremely isolated and extremely and very rural, kind of living by themselves type of places, okay? And this is also why a lot of people today don't want to admit loneliness or mental illness. Because what we'll see is loneliness is something we all experience, okay? Then in the 1930s and 1940s, we said, well, it's not a symptom, it is a consequence of a mental disorder and psychosis. So we experience loneliness because of our depression, because of our anxiety, and that pushes people away, okay? And then once that was kind of debunked, because it didn't really explain everything, loneliness was then seen as a personality trait. So, in fact, I believe it is still on the MMPI, which we'll get to when we get to the personality section. But it was believed that loneliness was a personality trait, that only certain people experience loneliness, okay? It wasn't until and since the 1970s that loneliness has been defined as an emotional experience that is experienced by everyone, because we have done enough surveys to realize that everyone at one point in our life will experience this thing we define as loneliness. So this is where we get to the description. And then we wanted to understand, and this is where we can get to the 1980s and 1990s, where reasons people experience loneliness, and it comes down to loss. It comes down to not having a strong identity, and being able to have groups you identify with. So if we look, for example, on very fringe groups, people who experience, for example, transgender, transsexual people, very early on, people who are gay and lesbian, they experience high rates of loneliness because it was very difficult to find your tribe in those contexts. Because one, it wasn't until the early 2000s that it was comfortable for people to come out and say that they were gay, lesbian, or transgender. And so even in the workplace, you might have had like 5 to 10 coworkers in the same situation, but it wasn't socially acceptable for you to express it, okay? And then as we look into the advent of social media, where individuals in these groups could connect with each other, and the movements, that we've seen rates of loneliness decrease within these groups, okay? And so when we come to understanding, we kind of have looked at those groups that have traditionally measured high in loneliness, and look at the reasons why it reduces over time, okay? And then we come to predict it. So when can we predict someone will experience loneliness? And this is in the 2000s where most of this is. And what, so we want to know what are the experience of loneliness, what are the consequences of loneliness, and what are some of the situational drivers. And I'll tell you, at this point in our understanding of prediction, is that it does seem that there is a biological component to loneliness. We know that people who measure high in loneliness over an extended period of time, this actually predicts things like mortality and morbidity better than eating habits, exercise habits, and smoking habits, okay? And it's independent of those things. It doesn't mean that a lonely person starts eating bad, stops exercising, and starts smoking. No, it independently predicts those things, okay? And this is because if we look at our biology, we are what's considered a social being. And once we start to lose our social world, we actually start to biologically die. Okay, and so that's kind of the prediction behind this, is we know that people who experience loneliness the most tend to not to survive anymore. They stop thriving and only start to survive, and their health deteriorates very rapidly because of it. Okay, and then we want to look at control. What are just started to investigate, and these are things we're starting to understand, is just hired UK just hired a person to investigate belongingness and loneliness as part of their understanding of the health of their country. And they feel that by increasing belongingness and decreasing loneliness, it'll actually increase the health and well-being of their population. So when we talk about control, this is something that is going on. You probably have seen some of the TV ads about calling a friend, checking in on each other. I think on one commercial, there's an acronym about getting connected with other people and your friends and family. And this is very much about kind of this experiments we're trying to do in psychology about how do we control the effects of loneliness on our populations. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna stop here for today because it'll only take us a while to get through the rest of this on Tuesday, and me and Luke are kind of starting to close our eyes. But I'm gonna stop here and I'm gonna stop the recording.